as the bâtonnier mentioned, I'm the Regional Director for Sub-Saharan Africa of the Rule of Law Initiative of the American Bar Association, also known as ABA-ROLI. I expect many of you are aware of the ABA or familiar with what we do, and so without going into too much detail, I want to summarize just that the Rule of Law Initiative is a nonprofit international development program of the ABA that for over 25 years has collaborated with partner organizations around the world to promote justice, economic opportunity, and human dignity through the rule of law. We have experience working in over 100 countries in 5 geographic regions, in Asia, Eastern Europe and Eurasia, Latin America and the Caribbean, the Middle East and North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And there are some summaries of our work on the table in the back. I will focus my remarks today on 3 ways that the rule of law maintains peace, with a particular emphasis on the role of women in each of the 3. So these are facilitating access to justice, building confidence in state institutions, and empowering individuals and communities to articulate their priorities and advocate for their rights. And in each of these cases, I'll try to give 2 or 3 brief examples of the types of activities through which ABA-ROLI has provided technical assistance, and then try to highlight in the end ways in which attorneys and bar associations can become involved and have been involved in this work. So first on facilitating access to justice, we know that experiences and perceptions of injustice can ignite and drive conflict. And during periods of insecurity, formal justice institutions are often abandoned and otherwise weakened. And then in the post-conflict period, these institutions can be quite slow to rebuild. As I was saying, we know that experiences and perceptions of injustice can ignite and drive conflict. And during periods of insecurity, formal justice institutions are often abandoned or weakened. And then in post-conflict periods, these institutions can be quite slow to rebuild, which leaves traumatized populations particularly vulnerable. For refugee and displaced populations, this lack of access to justice can be made even more severe by an unfamiliar context in which customary dispute resolution mechanisms are foreign and the formal rules may be different from the rules that one is familiar with. So ABA-ROLI works to facilitate access to justice in conflict and post-conflict settings in several ways, including providing direct legal services, often through support to local bar associations, to local lawyers, and to other civil society partners, and also by providing legal information that can help refugees and displaced persons better understand and navigate the legal contexts in which they find themselves. When possible, this work follows an assessment of what the specific barriers to access are in a given context. And sometimes these are very straightforward. So when courts haven't reopened, or distance or cost, or simply prohibitive. But they can also be less apparent barriers, as when fear of retribution or re-traumatization can cause a victim to avoid facing her attacker in front of a court. So for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the context of the humanitarian emergency in the mid-2000s, the ABA worked with Congolese lawyers who were acting as victims advocates, specifically for women who wished to bring legal cases against perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. And our assistance sought to overcome and identify a range of different barriers that these women were facing that prevented them from seeing a case through to its conclusion, even if they initiated the case. And we termed this holistic legal aid, and it included establishing legal aid clinics to which women could bring individual complaints, working in partnership with medical service providers and with the police, who are often the first place that women go to report violence, so that they had the information necessary to advise women on their legal options as well. We staffed these clinics with psychosocial counselors as well as attorneys so that they could respond to the trauma needs of the victims, and established safe homes in towns where the courts were located, often far from the villages where these women had been attacked, so that the women could stay often with their children as cases which can take quite a long time progressed. In addition, we facilitated mobile courts where we could bring courts to the victims, particularly in mass atrocity cases when it was not feasible to bring the victims to the courts. And then finally, this work involved advocacy at the provincial level as well as ultimately the national level to apply best practices in witness and victim identity protection, which ultimately resulted in the ability of victims in these cases to veil their faces and to keep their identities concealed. In another example in Turkey, as I believe that my colleague Nikki spoke with you in October about the work that we've been doing there, we have worked with Turkish lawyers to provide legal information to Syrian refugees to help them understand their rights under their temporary protection status, rights to basic medical care, to education, and to work permits. And this program identified communication as the primary barrier to access. And so in addition to holding awareness-raising sessions and producing brochures with legal information in Arabic, this program supported more innovative uses of technology. So for example, using SMS as a way to blast legal information to a large population of refugees at once, and creating an SMS helpline through which Syrian refugees could text legal questions in Arabic, which we would then translate into Turkish. Turkish lawyers could give their responses in Turkish and have that translated back in an SMS in Arabic to the person who would pose the question. In a third example, in a context a little bit more removed from the immediacy of conflict in Macedonia, the Balkan Regional Rule of Law Network, which is a defense network, a defense attorney network supported by ABA-ROLI, organized a training on gender-based violence in response to a perceived concern that the police and the social services were not responding to domestic violence incidents, rather treating them as a private matter. And this was even though there were protection mechanisms that existed under the domestic law. Each lawyer who participated in the training committed to doing 10 hours of pro bono work in support of victims of gender-based violence. And as a result of the training, and not just the training, but a network of legal support created by the participants in the training between themselves. This past fall, one of the family attorneys who had participated in the training was able to secure a protection order for one of his clients in a divorce case who had been hospitalized as a result of abuse by her husband. And that case, at the moment, they're seeking a similar protection order for her children. So that's the access to justice component. On the second issue of building confidence in state institutions, this includes legal and justice institutions, but also the legal barriers to accessing other government services. So, for example, assisting individuals to navigate administrative systems that are required to replace identity documents that may have been lost during conflict. Often these identity documents are a prerequisite for accessing health services or education or other available government services. This also applies to refugees who are seeking to navigate the legal system of a host country in order to begin often a new life in a new place. So as an example of this in Armenia, ABA-ROLI has created a refugee legal assistance center which addresses the needs of newly naturalized citizens, as well as asylum seekers, as well as refugees, including the most recent influx of Syrian refugees. And the services that were provided in this, that are provided in this center, were determined based on an initial needs assessment done with these different populations, which revealed both a need for information on individual rights, but also a great demand for information on the legal framework relevant to starting a small business. And so through the Legal Assistance Center, ABA-ROLI supported producing a Know Your Rights guide that was actually updating a guide that had originally been produced by the Office of the Public Defender in Armenia, but has also provided direct legal assistance to entrepreneurs who have been hit with very high penalties in Armenian courts after, for example, having all of their assets seized after forfeiting on a business loan. The Refugee Legal Assistance Center has assisted such individuals to successfully petition for relief from the Armenian courts when the courts have overstepped in severe penalties. A second example of this type of work is in Mali, where we work in the context of transitional justice, where the state institutions that we're seeking to build confidence in include both the National Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the courts, particularly in northern Mali outside of Bamako. Neither of these institutions enjoy much confidence from the population. In the court system, we've provided support to lawyers and to advocates to file the first cases in courts, particularly in the north, where judges have just recently been deployed. And then we're supporting the continuation of these cases through to the final adjudication, partially so that parties can see and experience the proper functioning of the justice system, and will therefore be encouraged to bring additional cases in the future and use the system in the future. With the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, we've supported victims of the conflict to draw on their individual experiences and build coordinated advocacy campaigns as a victims association so that they can channel the perspective of victims into the creation of a national transitional justice policy for the country, and then continue to put pressure on the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission to make space for the voices of victims as they roll out their activities under this policy. So the third category of involvement that I mentioned was empowerment of individuals, organizations, and communities. And I know that this term can be a bit of development jargon, but in the context in which we're using it, it refers specifically to giving voice to populations that have been marginalized and might otherwise continue to be overlooked. So in the Central African Republic, as one example, ABA-ROLI worked with women-led civil society groups to represent women's priorities in a national constitutional reform process. And this work is based on a theory that women have a particular role to play in peace building, not only in advocating for peace, but also contributing to the design of post-conflict reconstruction so that it responds to their needs and often also to the needs of their children. And there are several steps to this work, as there would be in any context where there's in the past been a real lack of representative democracy. So initially, this work focused on helping civil society groups to think in a new way about the type of power they had and the type of role they could play. Most of these groups have been acting as service providers, as a sort of substitute for government services, so doing literacy training or providing basic health care, rather than seeing themselves as spokespersons for a constituency or group of people. So it also then involved building the capacity of the groups to actually canvass a constituency, gather their views, gather their opinions on things and their priorities, and aggregate that data into a coherent policy proposal or a legislation proposal. And then to feel themselves powerful enough to advocate to go and speak before a national policymaking body. That's very new for civil society in the Central African Republic. So once this had been done, some of the priorities that these women's groups proposed did indeed become part of the constitutional principles in the new constitution. And so our work continued then to a step of how do you develop the national legislation to implement or to make real those principles in the Constitution, and then how do you track implementation of that legislation so that you can continue to advocate for the realization of the change that drove the principles in the first place. This, of course, is not a response only to an immediate transitional justice context, but it's an investment in the long-term stability of the Central African Republic. Because as the state institutions become stronger and start to provide the services that are more their responsibility, that role will be less needed from civil society, but they will need to continue to represent and advocate for a constituency to make sure that the state institutions deliver adequate services, that they sustain the public confidence, and that the services that they provide are seen as being just. Finally, a similar sort of advocacy grew out of our efforts in Armenia that I mentioned earlier to respond to the legal needs of entrepreneurs trying to start small businesses. So in addition to the individual legal assistance, ABA-ROLI worked with the Syrian-Armenian Union, which is one of our partners on that project, to support advocacy to the Justice Ministry to change some of the laws that have adverse impacts on these groups. So proposed reforms include things that would, for example, reduce the economic barrier to starting a business by reducing the cost of hiring a notary, or that would give new businesses more time to get up and running before payments are due on loans, or by doing things like lowering the tax rate on new businesses temporarily. So there are a number of proposed reforms like that that could have a longer-term impact on the ability of newly naturalized citizens and asylum seekers to succeed economically. So finally, I wanted to just highlight some of the roles that attorneys and bar associations have played and can play in supporting this type of work, in two groups. So first, attorneys and bar associations from the local context in which the services are being provided. As most of you know, bar associations and judiciaries can contribute to building confidence in the institutions of justice by strengthening the ethical standards of the profession. So for example, corruption in justice systems feeds on disorganization, and it feeds on a lack of public awareness of what the bounds are of appropriate behavior of the actors in that system. And so the creation and operationalization of complaints mechanisms, of disciplinary mechanisms for both lawyers and judges, transparency about how the system is supposed to function and how it is functioning, all of those sorts of activities can help combat this sort of systemic corruption. In addition, the commitment to taking on pro bono clients, which I know the UIA has made a strong commitment to do, particularly in the areas of expertise of the individual attorneys, is vitally important. So the example from the Balkans, where it was a family court attorney who was able to use his specific expertise to then provide services in the domestic violence context, is a good example of this. And then putting pressure on governments to provide for and fund defense bars and public defender programs to ensure that defense counsel are available to criminal defendants in cases, as well as fighting impunity through prosecution services. That's a fundamental principle of people perceiving the system as just and perceiving the value of the rule of law. In somewhat more stable settings, strategic litigation can also create pressure on administrative agencies, so ministries of labor or ministries of public works, to build confidence in the ability of the system to police itself, to provide just services across the range of government services, not just specifically legal services. And then the second category of attorneys and bar associations would be those from other countries who are willing and able to offer services outside of their borders. So the work that ABA-ROLI is doing, for example. And I would say there are three main contributions here. The first is expertise. But what's often lacking in post-conflict settings is expertise in systems. So weaknesses in court administration, for example, ad hoc calendaring practices that lead to victims and witnesses not knowing when they're supposed to be in court and cases being delayed for an extended period of time. Poorly organized filing systems or archives that have been destroyed during conflict. So legal professionals with this type of experience in establishing or maintaining or strengthening these types of systems have a great deal to offer. Similarly, experts in particular areas of law as legal educators can be invaluable as curriculum consultants, trainers, mentors, particularly when they can offer examples of best practices from their home jurisdictions that have gone through similar periods of transition. So in addition to expertise, legal resources, of course, are incredibly important, and developing legal resources requires financial resources, so to provide updated textbooks and curricula for law schools, bench books for judges, copies of the code for courts that are just reopening, and the tools to harmonize domestic legal frameworks where maybe one piece of the law has been reformed and it no longer matches with the other types of domestic law. And then finally, non-legal resources, transportation of victims to get to court, security during court proceedings, And outside observers who sometimes, without a huge financial commitment, just the presence of an outside observer in court can increase the adherence of the proceedings to legal norms. So these are just a handful of examples. I have several more. I'd be happy to talk more about any of these examples or answer questions, particularly about our work in sub-Saharan Africa, or to put any of you in touch with my colleagues who work in any of our field offices elsewhere in the world. Thank you.